How's everybody doing? Hope all my subscribers are having a great day. And today we're going to watch an interview that was had with Jordan Peterson with a media outlet known as Vox. The interviewer seemed to want to pose questions of gender politics, and it seemed as though they were not well composed. And Vox is also known to be a very leftist, libertarian, I think, magazine, as they call themselves. Even though I am not aware of any publishing that they actually have, but they are a very aggressive left media outlet. And I just wanted to show how Jordan just picks apart some of the ideology constructions of why some of these proponents of gender politics happen in society.
Hello, Jordan. This is Sean. How are you?
Hi, Sean. How's it going?
Not bad, thanks. Thanks for making time for us again.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I guess you've gone through a bit of a transformation recently, I think, from being, a psychologist at the University of Toronto to being sort of a celebrated author and a celebrity and someone who has a huge following online. I wonder just briefly if you could tell me a bit about how that transition has been for you.
Well, it's gone from rocky to quite good. I mean, initially, when I made my first videos, it was rocky because my job was at risk and perhaps my practice as a clinician as well. But as this has progressed over the last year and a half, it's become increasingly positive. And I think the reason for that is because what I'm saying is being listened to by lots of people, and it's not fundamentally a political message.
Justin Trudeau once tweeted out earlier this year, "It's incredibly inspiring and motivating to see so many people come out to support women's rights. We see you, we hear you, and Maryam Monsef and our government will keep fighting for gender equality in Canada. Hashtag Women's March 2018. Your response to that tweet was, "Is that the murderous equity doctrine, Justin Trudeau? Do you understand where that leads?
Yeah.
Or do you think you'll do it differently?"
Sure.
My question is, sometimes I read things you write and they seem to incite the sort of toxicity we see on the internet that you seem on some level to want to avoid. You seem to want people to live their best possible lives. And then when I see tweets like that or hear some of the speech you use sometimes, it feels opposed to that self-betterment.
I think that's because, with all due respect, that you fail to understand the danger of the equity doctrine. Look at it this way. In the 20th century, we saw mass murders take place on the right and the left. And we have some sense of when the right goes too far. Now, we know perfectly well that in the 20th century on the left, about 100 million people were killed in the name of political repression. But we don't have any clear guidelines for deciding when people on the left go too far, although clearly they can go far. And my study of totalitarianism, both on the right and the left, has indicated that the left go too far when they start to push equity doctrines. And so you might think that all that Trudeau's doing is trying to be nice to women, but I see something far darker underneath that. And with all due respect, I suspect I'm more informed about that particular element of history than you are.
That might be fair, but I feel like with all due respect, you might incite more hateful feelings on the internet than I do too.
It's possible, but I would also take issue with that. I think that the bulk consequence of what I've done so far is that I've convinced thousands of young men to stay away from the alt-right, for example, and move them much more towards an individual sovereignty and liberal position.
Now, just to give you some insight here, what the interviewer is referring to as the quoted murderous equity doctrine spoken about by Justin Trudeau, the equity doctrine refers to a set of associated proceeds involved in civil law. The law of equity is important in Canadian law as state law and common law. It operates to provide equitable relief when there is no recognizable wrongdoing, but no current remedy or litigation under the common law. This leniency would allow induction of possible controversial laws such as a public binary gender identity, equal party payment reprimandments, It would just induct a leniency that from a governmental body point of view, from the public, is potentially not preferable. I would use that word. That's what they're speaking about. And Jordan is saying that, well, a leniency of that level inducted into government is maybe not the best idea.
I want to talk about oppression for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I'm going to play a little clip here from one of your lectures so that we're really grounded in what you said.
You're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed, you're oppressed. God only knows why. Maybe you're too short, or you're not as beautiful as you could be, or your grandparent was a serf, likely, because almost everybody's great-grandparent was. It's like, and you're not as smart as you could be, and you have a sick relative, and you have your own physical problems, and it's like, frankly, you're a mess. And you're oppressed in every possible way, including your ancestry and your biology, and the entire sum of human history has conspired to produce victimized you with all your individual pathological problems. It's like, yes, true.
Do you ever worry that saying something like that might create a false equivalency between different kinds of oppression?
No, because I'm not willing to view the world through the oppression identity politics lens. And I think the fact that we do that virtually reflexively now is extraordinarily dangerous. And even if there are ethnic differences in historical oppression on some timescales, which is undoubtedly true, that doesn't mean that we divide people into tribes now and we assign blame for those historical inequities. All it'll do is tribalize us, and you can see that happening like mad in the West and in Europe right now. It's very dangerous.
I grew up in Toronto, and I'm just speaking from the perspective of someone who experienced, like sort of systemic racial prejudice everywhere I went. That's my framework. I don't know if it's neo-Marxism or postmodernism, or if it's just my reality.
I mean, there's arbitrary obstacles standing in people's way. Some of those have to do with gender, some of them have to do with race and prejudice and bias and all that. But the landscape around us with regards to those things is improving very rapidly. It's much better than it has been in the past. And I still think that the proper way to construe the situation is to look to yourself as an individual.
Don't you think that worldview doesn't necessarily apply to every situation? I mean, you're saying we're doing better, but, New York's doing better than Alabama. Toronto's doing better than Wisconsin. There's just any number of experiences there that you're not really considering.
Yeah, but Alabama is doing a lot better than Alabama was 30 years ago. The fact that there are still places where prejudice is a problem is self-evident. People are tribal by nature, but we don't contend with it by turning to an identity politics view of the world. It's not going to help. And I see Trudeau doing that all the time. To return to your initial question, I don't think he has any idea what sort of fire he's playing with.
Oppression through racial prejudice, gender bias, social class. What Jordan Peterson is talking about is this topic and air of oppression that is felt by recent generations, a stigma that their success is somehow hindered through patriarchy or otherwise. But this has been spoken about by Jordan, and many college studies have been done on this. Society, prejudice politics, and social mannerisms of the past were far, far worse than any degree of oppression we have today. In fact, to even compare the two, gentrifications is almost a deplorable statement. We are at a higher state of social cohesion, acceptance than ever before in human history, in the most developed and progressive nation that it inhabits. And that's not to say that I or this ideology is opposed to the endeavor of still trying to benefit equality of all facets. It's simply implying that complaining about it will not impose benefit. You can dwell in your own disposition and mediocrity if you please, but it's not benefiting anyone, and certainly not yourself.
When I see that tweet from Justin Trudeau, I see a guy who's saying like, hey, it's great to see all these women out in solidarity supporting equal rights for women.
He wasn't supporting equal rights. He was supporting equality of outcome. And he was the same person who formulated his cabinet. It was one of his first acts as leader to ensure that his cabinet was 50% women and 50% men, despite the fact that only 25% of the elected people were women. He selected his cabinet on the basis of their genitalia. That's not an appropriate use of discriminative power. It's not the way you select competent people.
But Jordan, haven't men been selecting cabinets based on genitalia for like centuries?
I would just like to add in here that that is a very apparent and obvious straw man argument where you're simply applying a consensus of belief that was not upheld or believed in by the previous discussion, whereas this is the point in which I think the Vox interviewer is realizing that he is becoming almost a bit ridiculed by Jordan because he has obviously not deconstructed these ideologies as much as he has, and he is simply trying to pander to get Jordan to have a consensus to some irrational statement, maybe for magazine headlines or something of that nature. But this is where I think the interviewer realizes that Peterson is almost ridiculing his irrational beliefs.
No, I think that's an insane way of looking at the world. I really do believe that. You really think that the right way to look at the world, the entire history of the world, that was up until we became enlightened in like the year 2000, what men were primarily doing was oppressing women.
I don't think women were even allowed to be in these rooms for much of the entire history of the world.
You accept this oppression narrative without question. 120 years ago...
I don't accept anything without question. I'm just telling you a fact.
That's not a fact.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
Women were expected to stay home and take care of the kids and cook a meal.
Women didn't have reliable birth control until 1960. Don't you think that played a role? Don't you think the fact that they didn't have reliable care for their menstrual cycles...
Are you blaming women for not being allowed to lead countries, to lead nations?
This is another fallacy where the interviewer tries to pit Jordan into provoking some sort of consensus of belief that is irrational or ridiculous, and that's not what Jordan is saying. Jordan is simply saying that the current standards of gender equality in the modern day is at a well enough acceptable degree to give equal opportunity to both genders. That is all Jordan is pertaining to the conversation. The interviewer is trying to bait and corner Jordan into this irrational, they're trying to bait him, basically.
Because they
were allowed to lead nations. There were queens in many countries. I think you have no idea how much this oppression narrative has saturated your thinking. Even though it's self-evident that what happened for most of human history was that men and women were terribly oppressed by the conditions of nature and not by each other.
Do you think, is it not true that in the United States and Canada, at least, women weren't allowed to vote until much later than men? They weren't allowed to hold elected...
What's your point? Do you think that was merely a consequence of men's oppression of women? You think that's the only causal factor at play?
No, I mean, my point is that to see Justin Trudeau say, I'm going to make a point of appointing a cabinet that's equally male and female might just be Justin Trudeau saying, like, wouldn't it be nice to have women in the room?
Yeah, it might be, but it might be his absolute naivety and his swallowing of the victimization narrative and his inability to properly formulate a cabinet because he didn't want to do the difficult decision-making and would rather look good on a virtue signaling basis, too.
I agree.
So you can have your viewpoint of it, and I can have mine. We'll see how it plays out.
I'm a person of color. I went to college with a white man. We shared a bedroom. We were very close. We were roommates, and he had a pretty tough childhood, and he would often lament that the university we went to considered a person of color's story more compelling than his. And I would sometimes find it difficult to have that conversation with him because I too felt like a person of color's story in a country that, practiced slavery for a very long time was pretty compelling.
To unblur the lines here, I'm going to give you a backdrop of what they're actually pertaining to each other's statements. The interviewer is inferring that Jordan Peterson has an ideology of gender inequality because he believes that Justin Trudeau implemented his campaign statement of having half of his cabinet female as a way of pertaining to victimization to get more votes and have a better fairing of campaign. Whereas the Vox reporter is saying that in reality it is because Jordan feels some sort of gender dissociation, which of the modern day, which is not true, and that's not what Jordan is saying. He is simply saying that Justin Trudeau is just playing the victim card to better his campaign, while as actually enforcing a more leniency within the equity doctrine that would probably be a detriment of consequence to society, specifically Canadian society.
What percentage of Eastern Europeans were serfs before 1880?
I don't have that information with me right now.
Right. Well, it's a relevant piece of information if you're going to talk about historical inequality. I mean, like I said, the past is absolutely dreadful, and most people lived under absolutely brutal conditions.
Are you kind of saying like everyone's been a slave at some point?
Well, read your history and find out. That isn't what I'm saying. That's how it was.
It just feels like a little slippery because then everyone's always on the same playing field, and that's just not the reality of our society.
It's your theory, but it's not mine. There's some systemic bias in favor of the majority in all countries, and that accounts for a proportion of people's failure and success, but it certainly doesn't account for all of it. And yes, the farther back you look in history, the more terrible you find people's situations to be. And if you're going to bring all that forward into the future in the form of guilt, there's going to be real hell to pay.
What Jordan Peterson is saying here is that if you assert that all inequality of all previous generations of humans is then to be asserted into a bias or social mannerisms that would then balance out equality, you're going to be in one hell of a disposition in your society because reprimandments of that degree cannot be sustained. And in fact, I think that's why a lot of people have said that racism, gender prejudice, and social class, it is, as they say, racism was a battle for our fathers. And it's because you cannot reprimand the prejudice and dispositions racially, socially, even through gender of past generations. It simply can't be done. And frankly, I did not beat slaves. Those slaves did not then benefit me. Racism, gender bias, social class, prejudice, it cannot be reprimanded socially. And what Jordan Peterson is simply saying is that the best thing to do is to just simply not dwell in that mediocrity, because there is no recognizable remedy that would disallow the disposition that these people were put in, and to just sit and pertain a claim and complain about it is just not beneficial. And I loved how through all of these interviews, Jordan Peterson seems incredibly well informed and seems as though he has been deconstructing these concepts in his head for a very long time. And after watching hundreds and hundreds of interviews in Jordan Peterson, I have only disagreed with very, very few of them. It is obvious that Jordan Peterson has sat and thought about identity politics and racial prejudice for a very long time. And this right here is just more proof of just complete ridicule of a left-bearing argument that had no substantiation of basis. And Jordan Peterson showed that.
Tell me pretty lies, look me in the face. Tell me that you love me,